sir. I can make your boy walk again," the skinny black girl on the corner told the real estate tycoon. Mason Larraby had marched past that side alley off Clark 100 times. But never like this. Never with the dull grind of wheelchair wheels replacing the easy slap of running shoes. Never with silence so thick it muffled Chicago's constant honking and chatter. His son, Jonah, sat slumped in the chair, wrapped in a faded Cubs hoodie that used to hang off his shoulders. Now, it just looked tired. Jonah was 11, but it had been nearly 2 years since his feet had touched the ground on their own. Mason, once branded the man who rewired Chicago by business magazines, had turned busted warehouses and boarded up walk-ups into glass towers. He'd bent whole neighborhoods to his will. But he still couldn't convince his son's legs to move. He'd turned blight into skyline views worth billions, stacked his name on glossy covers, and watched lenders beg to be in his deals. In boardrooms, contracts bent like paper in his hands, but nothing in his portfolio meant a thing in hospital corridors. The skiing trip to Vail had been his idea, a celebration after closing a monstrous downtown purchase. One bad turn on an icy run, one sickening crack, and Jonah's laughter was replaced by sirens. The surgeons had been clinical and careful. Thoracic vertebra crushed, spinal cord bruised, permanent paralysis from the chest down. They said the word permanent like it was math, not a sentence. Hope, once Mason's gasoline, had turned into sandpaper, scraping him raw every time he let himself imagine Jonah walking. He was pushing the chair past the alley, lost in those thoughts, when he heard the girl's voice again. "Mister," the girl repeated, a little louder, "I really do know how to help your son stand up again." Mason tightened his grip on the wheelchair handles and turned. He expected some middle-aged hustler stepping out with a plastic bag of miracle supplements or a stack of flyers for a sketchy clinic. Instead, a small figure slipped from behind a dented recycling bin. She couldn't have been more than 9. Her skin was deep brown, her dark eyes steady and older than her round face. A ripped gray hoodie hung off one shoulder. Her jeans were stained with city grit. On her feet, sneakers held together with duct tape and stubbornness. But she didn't fidget or look away. She held his gaze like she was used to people underestimating her. "Excuse me?" Mason asked, that old executive edge sharpening his tone despite the ache behind it. "I said I can help your son," the girl repeated, like she was used to not being heard the first time. "My name's Nia. I crash at the church shelter on Wells." She jerked her chin toward the end of the block. "I saw you guys yesterday. He looked really sad." Jonah's eyes lifted from the cracked sidewalk. There wasn't fear in them or pity, just a quiet curiosity that Mason hadn't seen in weeks. "You've been watching us?" Mason asked, suspicion sliding into his voice. "Only a little," Nia replied, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I sit on that corner most days. People walk by like I'm invisible." "But you stopped. You picked up his glove when he dropped it and actually handed it back. You didn't look annoyed. You didn't rush him. I figured you might actually listen." Mason frowned, glancing down at Jonah, who was still staring at Nia like she'd stepped out of one of his old adventure stories. "My son's situation isn't sadness, young lady," Mason said, that boardroom firmness creeping back into his voice. "It's spinal trauma, his nerves—" "Didn't forget," Nia interrupted quietly. "They just shut the door for a while." Mason blinked. "That's what my grandma used to tell folks," she added. "Sometimes the body doesn't stop because it's busted. It stops because the heart gets tired of hurting all the time." Mason gathered a deep breath, ready to bury her in medical language he'd memorized during sleepless nights scrolling through research. Before he could fire a single term, Jonah's voice slipped out, cracked from disuse. "Dad, maybe we could just check it out?" The question shook Mason more than any prognosis ever had. Just for a little while, Mason shut his eyes for a second, exhaling hard. The rational part of his brain screamed that this was reckless, that he was about to push his vulnerable son after a stranger through back streets he usually drove past with the doors locked. But the part of him that had watched Jonah sink quieter every week couldn't ignore the spark in his boy's eyes. "If anything feels off, we're done," Mason said finally, crouching so he was eye level with Jonah. "The second you're uncomfortable, we leave. Deal?" Jonah nodded, the movement small but determined. The corners of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the closest thing Mason had seen in a long time. "Okay," Naya said, already turning like the decision had been inevitable. "Come on." She led them away from Michigan Avenue, deeper into streets where the buildings leaned together like they were sharing secrets. They moved through the city's underbelly, away from polished storefronts and into blocks the tour buses never mentioned. Mason guided Jonah's chair over busted concrete, dodging broken glass, old gum, and crooked bricks that tried to catch the wheels. The air shifted from roasted coffee and perfume to exhaust, damp brick, and yesterday's rain. Every few yards, Mason's instinct screamed at him to turn back, to call the car, to pretend he hadn't heard Nia at all. But she walked ahead with a steady, unhurried pace, hands stuffed in her sleeves like she'd made this trip 1,000 times. Jonah kept twisting to look at everything: the faded murals, the stray cat weaving between trash cans, the way sunlight cut down narrow alleys. Hope sat in Mason's chest like a fragile, illegal thing. Maybe he was insane. Or maybe he was just too tired to keep saying no. They finally turned into a narrow courtyard tucked behind a row of tired brownstones that looked like they'd given up on impressing anyone decades ago. Rusty fire escapes clung to the brick like spiderwebs. A sagging fence leaned against a stack of milk crates. At the far end, half hidden under climbing ivy and spray-painted tags, was a weather-beaten wooden door. Naya didn't knock, she just pressed her palm against it. It creaked open like it had been expecting her. Mason hesitated on the threshold, every expensive instinct honed by security consultants flashing red. But Jonah was already leaning forward, eager. The room inside was lit mostly by sunlight, squeezing through gaps in the patched ceiling and one grimy side window. Dust floated through the beams like slow-motion snow. It smelled faintly of lemon balm, church candles, and the dry paper weight of old books. On a threadbare rug near a low-scarred table sat a woman, her back straight despite her age, silver hair coiled into a bun the size of a grapefruit at the base of her neck. Her skin was as deep as Nia's, her face a map of lines that looked carved by laughter and loss in equal measure. She didn't act surprised to see them. "I was wondering when you'd bring him," she said to Nia, voice smooth as river stones rolled for years. Mason's shoulders tensed. "How did you know we were coming?" he demanded. The woman looked at him with a gentleness that somehow felt heavier than anger. "I don't know the future, sir," she said. "But I know pain, and I know the sound of it when it finally walks to my door." Jonah leaned forward in his chair, eyes widening. "Who are you?" Jonah asked, his voice thin but clearer than Mason had heard it in days. The woman's smile deepened the lines around her mouth as she shifted closer, moving with deliberate, patient grace. "Just somebody who listens," she said. "Somebody your friend here trusts." She nodded at Naya, then looked back at Jonah. "Is it all right if I touch your knees, sweetheart?" Jonah's fingers tightened on the armrests. His gaze flicked to Mason. For a long second, father and son just studied each other. This wasn't a clinic. No monitors, no white coats, no sterile smell. Just a busted ceiling, an old rug, and a stranger who hummed. Mason's heart pounded anyway. "If you don't like it, we stop right away," he said. Jonah shook his head. "I want to try." Mason nodded once. "Okay," he breathed. "Go ahead." She laid her rough, warm hands over Jonah's knees. Her eyelids lowered until only a thin line of brown showed. From somewhere deep in her chest, a low hum rose, a melody without words that still felt like it belonged to Sunday mornings and worn church pews. It threaded through the room, soft but steady. For a moment, nothing changed. Then Jonah gasped. His legs jerked beneath her palms, a tiny jump hardly bigger than a shiver, yet unmistakable. "I felt something," he whispered, as if a louder voice might scare it away. Like a gentle shock, not painful, just buzzing. Mason leaned in fast, knuckles whitening on the wheelchair. "What do you mean you felt something?" he demanded, every syllable edged with panic. The woman opened her eyes. No lightning, no drama, just weary kindness. "His body remembers more than any chart can show," she said. "It didn't forget him. It just needed to be invited back." "That's not how recovery works," Mason blurted. "That's not medicine. There's no journal article about singing nerves awake." The protest sounded weak even to his own ears. The woman didn't bother arguing with him. She looked only at Jonah. "Do you want to try standing?" she asked. Silence settled in. Jonah licked his lips. "What if I fall?" he murmured. "Then you fall," she replied gently. "But at least you'll know what your legs can still feel on the way down." Jonah stared at her, then at his father. Mason could practically hear every warning from every specialist echoing in his skull. Machines, harnesses, teams of therapists, not some stranger in a drafty room. But Jonah's eyes were bright and scared and stubborn. "Yeah," he whispered, "I think I do." The woman shifted her hands to his thighs and reached for his elbows, anchoring him like a safety rail. "Slow," she murmured. "Let your body remember." Jonah pushed through his arms. His shoulders shook with effort. His legs, thin from disuse, wobbled like new branches in a storm. Mason lunged forward on instinct, but the woman lifted one hand, stopping him with a look. "Let him," she said quietly. Jonah's left foot shifted, barely an inch, just enough for the rubber sole to scrape the rug. Then the right. His body leaned, wavered, and somehow stacked itself over his feet. And then he was up. Not fully straight, not solid, but no longer sitting. Jonah was standing. For the first time in almost 2 years, he was carrying his own weight. Mason dropped to his knees as if something had cut the strings behind them. "Joe!" he choked. "Oh my God, Joe!" The world narrowed to the sight of his son's shaking legs holding. His legs trembled under him. Thin muscles firing like they were waking from a long, angry sleep. Jonah's arms hovered at his sides, fingers spread, as if the air itself might help hold him up. Mason's breath hitched. The room, the cracked ceiling, the peeling paint, the old space heater buzzing in the corner, blurred at the edges. All he could really see were those feet planted on the rug. Jonah looked down at himself, then up at his father. Disbelief stretching across his face until it almost became a grin. Mason surged forward on his knees, hands out but not quite touching, terrified he'd break whatever impossible thing was happening just by laying a finger on it. "You're doing it," he choked. "Jonah, you're actually doing it. Jonah swallowed. Very slowly, he shifted his weight, dragging one foot forward in a clumsy, miraculous half-step. Then he tried another. The second movement was more of a wobble than a step, his knees shaking like they weren't sure about any of this. Halfway through it, Jonah's legs finally surrendered. His knees folded, and his body pitched forward. This time, Mason didn't hold back. He lunged, arms wrapping around his son's torso, pulling him tight against his chest before Jonah could hit the floor. "I've got you! I've got you!" Mason kept saying, words tumbling out on a ragged breath. Jonah clutched back, fingers digging into his father's shoulders. His whole body shook, but he was laughing and sobbing at the same time. "Dad!" he gasped against Mason's collar. "I felt them. I really felt my legs." Mason tried to answer. Nothing came out but a sound that was part laugh, part broken prayer. The kind of noise he'd never let anyone else hear from him before now. Nia stood a few feet away, hands tucked deep into the two long sleeves of her hoodie. She didn't smile or bounce or crow like she'd won something. Her eyes were calm, steady, almost solemn, as if she'd watched this exact scene play out more than once. The older woman stepped back a little, folding her hands in front of her, her expression peaceful, unsurprised. To her, it didn't look like magic. It looked like inevitability. Mason eased Jonah back into the wheelchair, still keeping one hand on his shoulder like he might vanish if he let go. Then he turned to the woman, cheeks wet, throat raw. "I need to know," he said quietly, "how you did that. What you did. I've spent 18 months hearing the word impossible from people with degrees. And you just," his voice cracked, "you just made my kid stand up." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "There isn't much to explain," she replied. "The body listens to more than just nerves and scanners. It listens to the heart. It listens to what a person believes about themselves." She glanced at Jonah, whose fingers were still twitching as if his legs were sending signals they'd forgotten how to send before. "Your son stopped trusting that he was anything more than broken," she went on. "Today, for the first time in a long time, he trusted something he couldn't see." Mason shook his head. "That's not how healing works," he said, but the fight had drained out of the words. "Then tell me," she answered gently, "how do you explain what you just watched?" Silence hollowed out his protests. Finally, Mason turned toward Nia. "Who are you really?" he asked. "Because you're not just some kid from a corner." Nia dropped her eyes for a second, brushing a loose curl off her cheek. "I'm just a girl who listens to stories," she said. "My grandma raised me when nobody else wanted to bother. She always said people don't always need fixing. Sometimes they just need reminding they weren't born broken." She stepped closer to Jonah's chair and crouched beside him. "I was born with a crooked foot," she admitted. "Kids laughed. Grown folks stared. I couldn't run, couldn't play tag, couldn't keep up with the ice cream truck." A faint smile tugged at her mouth at Jonah's wide-eyed stare. "One day, Grandma sat me on this same rug. She wrapped her hand around my ankle and hummed, just like today. She didn't promise anything. She just said, 'Stand up if you can, baby.' So I did. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely breathe." "And it worked?" Jonah asked, almost afraid of the answer. Nia nodded. "Next morning, I walked to school without dragging my foot," she said. "By the end of the week, I was running races with the boys on the block. I never limped again." Mason straightened slowly. "Where is she now?" he asked. "Your grandmother." Nia's smile thinned. She stared at a crack in the floorboards. "Gone," she said. Almost a year now. Stroke took her fast. Her voice snagged on the last word, the only sign of how much it still hurt. They stuck me in a foster house after the funeral, she continued. New sheets, new rules, new people pretending they understood. I lasted 3 days. Nobody believed Grandma's stories. They said she was a con artist, said I made everything up for attention. So I left. The streets listen better than they did. So you live out here now? Mason asked, his voice softer than before. Naya shrugged one shoulder. Most nights I get a cot at the church shelter on Wells, she said. Some nights I crash behind a bakery off Southport. The owner leaves the cardboard out and pretends he doesn't notice me. She lifted her chin, daring Mason to pity her. I'm all right. I help folks when I can, same way Grandma did. People come whispering about knees and backs and hearts that feel too heavy. Sometimes all I can do is sit with them. Sometimes they walk out different than they walked in. Jonah watched her like she'd stepped straight out of a comic book instead of an alley. Mason's chest tightened. The idea of a girl, Jonah's age, sleeping behind dumpsters scraped against everything his money had ever bought him. It made all his marble foyers feel suddenly small and pointless. The older woman moved beside them again, sliding a small cushion under Jonah's feet. He doesn't have to prove anything today, she said. Standing once is enough work for a room full of doctors. She showed Jonah how to sit with his feet flat, how to tighten his thighs and let them relax, how to picture himself stepping even when his body refused. You can practice this lying in bed, she told him. Wiggle your toes, talk to your knees, hum that little tune if it helps. Jonah nodded like she'd handed him secret cheat codes to his own body. Mason listened to every word, memorizing instructions the way he used to memorize deal points. Outside, a siren wailed and faded. Inside, the only sound was Jonah's uneven breathing and her low whisper promising they'd go slowly. How did it happen? The woman asked gently, as Jonah practiced tightening and releasing his legs. Mason stared at his hands for a moment. Veil, he said finally. A trip to celebrate a big closing. I told myself I was giving him memories. His jaw clenched. He wanted the easy runs. I talked him into trying a harder one, said I'd be right behind him. The picture replayed in his mind with horrible clarity. The sharp turn, Jonah's surprised shout, the sickening thud when his small body hit a hidden stump, the helicopter blades, the sterile blur of trauma bays. They said T6 vertebra, spinal cord damage, permanent paralysis, Mason continued. They used the word permanent like it was polite. The woman nodded, eyes soft. Guilt weighs more than any cast, she said. If you carry it too long, it starts crushing everything it touches. She had Mason sit on the rug too, legs stiff in his expensive slacks. Breathe, she instructed. Not like you're about to argue in a meeting, like you're trying to keep a candle from going out. He inhaled slowly, forcing air past the tightness in his chest. His shoulders dropped a fraction. You've been trying to buy your way around this hurt, she said. Hospital, specialists, machines, all good things. But in this room, you're not a developer. You're just his dad. Mason let out a breath that sounded almost like surrender. Jonah's hand found his and squeezed. Naya slipped into the tiny kitchen and came back with chipped mugs of tea, the steam carrying lemon and something floral. She passed one to Jonah first like it was the most natural thing in the world, and he grinned at her over the rim, shy but shining. After a while, Mason cleared his throat. What do you want for this? He asked the woman. His business voice tried to reappear. Payment, a donation, a retainer. She chuckled softly. "You already paid," she said. "You brought your boy, and you listened." She tilted her head. "If you want to give something, remember this place when he's running again. Remember there are kids like Nio on those corners you build past." Mason shook his head. "I can write you a check big enough to fix this whole building," he said. "Pipes, roof, everything. We won't say no to new pipes," she replied with a smile. "But I don't need your picture on a wall. Groceries, winter coats, keeping the lights on. That's the kind of help that matters here." Nia shot Mason a quick, almost hopeful look over the rim of her cup. It softened something in him. "What should we call you?" Jonah asked after a stretch of quiet. The woman smiled. "Most folks around here just say Miss Etta," she replied. "Came up from Mississippi a long time ago. My mama worked roots and herbs before me. Church folks called her a witch, until it was their babies coughing at midnight. Then they called her." She looked around the worn little room with obvious affection. Gifts like this don't survive by hiding. They're meant to be shared, handed down, or they soar. She nodded toward Naya. "This one listened better than most grown-ups ever did. She doesn't just watch where people hurt. She pays attention to what they believe about themselves." Naya's cheeks flushed, but her chin lifted with quiet pride. Jonah gave her a small thumbs up, as if officially confirming that being Miss Etta's apprentice was the coolest job on earth. Mason studied Nia for a long moment, really seeing her now. The duct-taped shoes, the hoodie with someone else's school logo, the tired eyes that still watched everything. "You shouldn't have to live like this," he said finally. "Sleeping on church cots and behind bakeries. You're just a kid." Nia's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "A lot of us are just kids," she replied. "But the streets don't care how old we are. The world forgets about us, unless we make it impossible to ignore." The words landed heavier than any closing argument Mason had ever given. He looked down at Jonah. His son had shifted upright in the chair, fingers tapping against his thighs with cautious excitement, like he was already testing invisible steps. For the first time in months, Mason didn't feel completely helpless. He just felt responsible. For Jonah, and maybe for Nia too. "I want to help you," Mason said to Naya. "I have resources, connections. I can get you a bed, school, a place that's actually safe." Nia shook her head, ponytail brushing her hoodie. "Thank you," she said. "But this corner, these streets, this is where I belong. Out where nobody's looking, with people who think hope is a store they can't afford. Grandma always said real healing starts there." Mason's chest tightened. The weight of his privilege pressed against the sharp truth in her words. She didn't want rescuing. She already had a mission. Still, he pulled a business card from his wallet, thick and embossed with his name and office number. "If you ever change your mind," he said, offering it to her, "or if you just need anything at all, call that number. My assistant answers 24/7. They always know how to reach me." The offer sat between them like a bridge neither quite knew how to cross. Mason felt that familiar squeeze of guilt in his ribs, the strange heaviness that came from knowing his world was elevators and private drivers, while hers was basement cots and backdoor leftovers. The sheer imbalance of it scraped at him. Naya wasn't asking to be rescued. She was already walking her own path, one she believed mattered. She took the card delicately, turning it over in her fingers as if it were some kind of talisman from another planet. Then she folded it once, clean and precise, and slipped it into a hidden pocket inside her hoodie. "Thank you," she murmured. Jonah reached out, surprising them both, and wrapped his hand around hers. "Will I see you again?" he asked quietly, almost like he was afraid the answer might disappear. Nia's mouth curved into a small, knowing smile. "If you ever forget again," she said, "if you start thinking you can't do it, I'll probably be somewhere close." Jonah's face lit up, fear and joy sparking together. He leaned forward and, without asking, threw his arms around her shoulders. For a heartbeat, she froze, unused to warm arms and clean laundry and someone clinging to her like she mattered. Then she slowly hugged him back. It was the first real embrace she'd felt in over a year. When they pulled apart, she brushed at a loose thread on her sleeve, suddenly shy. Behind them, Miss Etta rose, joints popping softly. "You should head on now," she said, voice gentle but firm. "The boy's taken his first step. Now the rest of the journey belongs to him and the people who love him." She gave Mason a steady nod. Mason nodded, throat thick, and adjusted his grip on the wheelchair handles. Jonah insisted on walking a few shaky steps first, palms pressed against the chair's arms for balance, before collapsing gratefully back into the seat. They left the courtyard and retraced their path through the city's forgotten blocks. Jonah didn't chatter, but his gaze stayed bright, tracking every passing shadow and stray dog like the world had shifted into sharper focus. That night, in their high-rise condo where the Chicago skyline burned like a promise behind floor-to-ceiling glass, Mason sat at the edge of his son's bed. Jonah's breathing slowed, easing into sleep, legs wrapped in a soft blanket instead of braces. "I can't make sense of it," Mason whispered into the dim room. "But I will never let myself forget it." He turned one of his own business cards over in his fingers, restless. He wondered what would happen to that hidden room beyond the alley, to Miss Etta with her Riverstone voice, to Nia with her duct-taped sneakers and stubborn courage. The questions circled him long after Jonah drifted off, until the city lights blurred like distant campfires. Somewhere across town, in a different neighborhood with the same cracked sidewalks, Nia sat cross-legged on a church basement floor beside a girl barely 7. The child hadn't spoken since her mother walked out 3 months before. Nia didn't pry. She didn't ask what happened or why. She simply laced their fingers together and started humming, that same low, ancient tune Grandma used to sing when the rent was late, and fear was loud. Because Nia had learned something vital. Sometimes healing didn't start with explanations. Sometimes it started with someone staying long enough to prove they weren't leaving. A week slid by, then another. Late October wrapped Chicago in a sharper chill, the kind that stung noses and turned breath into smoke. Leaves scraped along curbs like scattered unread letters. Mason started noticing how different the wind sounded when it wasn't dragging dread through his chest. Mornings no longer began with the hiss of wheelchair wheels and the clack of ramps. Instead, he woke to the tentative thump of Jonah's feet on hardwood, the soft slap of socks as his son shuffled from doorway to doorway. Each day, Jonah went a little farther. First from the bed to the dresser, then across the living room, then all the way down the hallway, one hand trailing along the wall like a safety rope. By the end of the second week, he made it from the elevator to the lobby door and back, wobbly but grinning. His physical therapists, who had slowly adopted a tone of professional politeness edged with resignation, now watched Jonah like they were witnessing a glitch in the universe. The boy described tingling in his calves, warmth along his thighs, a sense that his own body was slowly remembering him. They ran tests, measured angles, filmed short videos. Mason tried once to explain what had happened. In a conference room at the Children's Hospital in Hyde Park, surrounded by framed diplomas and blinking monitors, he told them about the alley, the old woman, the humming. The specialists traded glances. Could be a psychological trigger, one suggested carefully. A reactivation of dormant motor pathways via intense emotional stimulus, another offered. Their words were polished, clinical. None of them could explain why the first spark of movement had come not from a machine, but from a stranger's worn hands and a song. After that meeting, Mason stopped trying to package the story into something that made sense to anyone else. Some things just are, he decided late one night, staring at the city glittering below. The point wasn't why Jonah was walking again. The point was that he was. One gray afternoon, Mason came home early from a board presentation that suddenly felt irrelevant. He stepped into the condo and froze. In the living room, Jonah was braced in a half-squat, gripping a resistance band tied around a sturdy chair. His cheeks were flushed, hair damp with sweat, legs trembling, but holding. He straightened when he saw his dad, chest heaving. "Guess what?" he puffed. "Coach Ramirez says I might get to try out for the junior basketball team in spring. He says I've got muscle memory on my side." Jonah grinned, as if the word miracle was outlawed. Mason smiled back, but his mind had already drifted to an alleyway that still smelled like lemon balm and dust. He pictured Naya's too-big hoodie, Miss Etta's steady hands, that old rug under Jonah's feet. The idea that the girl who'd cracked something open in his son might just slip back into the city and disappear gnawed at him. That night, after Jonah fell asleep with a basketball magazine open on his chest, Mason sat at the kitchen island and pulled out his phone. He dialed the number printed on the card he'd handed Naya, listening to the ring echo in his ear. Voicemail. He tried again the next day and the next. A week crawled past with no answer. Finally, he started calling shelters, church basements, youth centers on the south side, asking about a skinny girl who hummed when people hurt. Most people just shrugged or stared. No one seemed to know where she'd gone. Some remembered a girl in an oversized sweatshirt with eyes too old for her age. A maintenance worker at a shelter said she used to hand out extra rolls and sit with kids who wouldn't talk to anyone else. At a youth center off Ashland, a volunteer with gray at her temples snapped her fingers, trying to recall. "Yeah," she said slowly, "the one who hummed those funny songs. Even the hot-headed teens calmed down when she did that." She shook her head. "Haven't seen her in days. She drifts. Helps where she can, then slips off, like a shadow with a conscience." Mason left his card and personal cell number everywhere he stopped, scrawling a simple promise on the back. "If Nia comes through, tell her I owe her more than I can ever explain." Still, nothing. Then, one washed-out afternoon, as clouds sagged low over the city, Mason turned his car onto Roosevelt near Loomis and almost missed her. A small figure sat on the curb outside a row of shuttered storefronts, back pressed to a graffiti-tagged wall. Nia. Her arms were wrapped around a younger boy, maybe 10 or 11, his skin pale under city grime. The kid's lower lip trembled. His right arm was cradled against his chest like it hurt to breathe. No adults hovered nearby. No emergency lights, no caseworkers, no clipboards. Just two kids trying to exist on concrete. Mason's heart lurched into his throat. Before he could overthink it, he swerved toward the curb and braked hard enough that his tires squealed against the asphalt. He killed the engine, palms suddenly slick, and stepped out slowly, careful not to spook them like some stranger in a suit. "Nay," Mason called softly. Her head snapped up, eyes wary for a split second before recognition softened them. "You found me," she said, a little wonder threading through her voice. "I've been trying to," Mason replied. "Couldn't get you out of my head." Nia helped the younger boy adjust his grip on his arm, then eased to her feet. "This is Tariq. she said. He took a tumble off a dumpster yesterday trying to grab a busted kite. I think his arm might be sprained. I've been watching him, making sure he doesn't do anything dumb with it. Mason scanned the empty sidewalk, the darkened shop windows, the absence of any grown-up backup. "There's no one else with you?" he asked. Nia shook her head like the answer was obvious. "Just us," she said. "For now, that's usually how it is out here. Most folks just keep walking past." "You can't keep doing this out here," Mason said, glancing at Tariq's makeshift sling, a knotted strip of hoodie string and determination. "Let me help, please." Nia's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed calm. "This is where people are bleeding," she answered. "In alleys, behind stores, in stairwells, nobody cleans. It's where Grandma worked. It's where I'm supposed to be." Mason shook his head. "But it's not safe," he insisted. "You're still a kid. You deserve better than cold sidewalks and borrowed blankets." Nia's eyes flashed, not with anger, but with something older. "You think I don't dream about a warm bed and a fridge that's always full?" she asked, gentle but fierce. "I do. But the folks I sit with, they've got no one. They trust me because I'm them. They don't see a caseworker. They see another kid who knows what hunger feels like." Mason exhaled, the sound somewhere between defeat and respect. Her conviction cut through him sharper than any boardroom insult ever had. "At least, let me give you choices," he said quietly. "A place to go when the cold gets dangerous. Somewhere you can lock the door and sleep without listening for footsteps. I'm not asking you to abandon what you're doing. I just don't want you to disappear in the middle of it." Nia looked from him to Tariq, who was leaning against the wall, eyes drooping with pain and exhaustion. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said. "A number I can call. Maybe a key for emergencies. That's fair." Mason pulled a small envelope from his coat and pressed it into her hand. "There's a debit card inside," he said. "No limit. And a key to an apartment uptown, stocked, safe, no questions ever asked." Nia didn't gush or cry or rush to unlock it right there. She just weighed the envelope in her hand like she understood exactly what it meant and what it didn't. Real help, she knew, wasn't about someone swooping in once with a camera-ready gesture. It was about staying. Showing up again, quiet, steady presence. "You know," she said after a moment, fingers tracing the edge of the paper, "Grandma used to say the city's heartbeat is loudest in the places nobody photographs. Back stairwells, alley stoops, shelter cots." She glanced up at Mason. "I think that's what you heard that day, not me. Just the city's heart finally getting through all the noise." Mason swallowed hard, unsure how to answer that. The idea that something bigger than both of them had nudged him into that alley made his usual explanations feel suddenly small and flimsy. "You remind me of someone I used to be," Mason said finally, "back before I started measuring everything in steel and square footage." Nia let out a soft laugh, the sound small but real. "Maybe you just circled around," she replied. "People don't always stay lost. Sometimes they wander back to where they started, just with more scars." They stood there for a moment, an impossible picture. A billionaire developer in a tailored coat and a streetwise girl in duct-taped sneakers, bound together by a boy who could walk again. Cars hissed past in the damp cold, but the sidewalk felt strangely still. "Will I see you again?" Mason asked. Nia tilted her head, considering. "Probably not the way you're imagining," she said. "But if somebody close to you forgets how to believe again, chances are I'll be somewhere nearby, humming to myself. That's just how this city works." That night, Jonah stood on the risers at his school's fall concert. No chair, no braces, just a navy blazer, khakis, and shoes that actually scuffed the stage. His steps were measured, but his chin was high. Parents craned their necks when they realized the boy they'd last seen rolling through hallways was now walking with his classmates. After the final song, the principal asked how he'd found the courage to push through. Jonah glanced at his dad, then out at the crowd. "A girl who believed I could," he said simply. 5 miles away, in a narrow alley behind a laundromat, Naya sat beside an elderly woman named Rosa, who hadn't really spoken since her husband died that winter. Naya didn't press for stories. She just held the woman's hand and hummed that same worn melody, letting the quiet stretch without trying to fix it. Nia still didn't ask questions. She didn't probe Rosa about the apartment that suddenly felt too quiet, or the empty chair at the kitchen table. She didn't offer cheer-up cliches or promises she couldn't keep. She just stayed. Her thumb traced small circles over the back of Rosa's hand as she hummed, letting the lull of her voice do the work words rarely managed. Over these months, Nia had come to understand something her grandmother had tried to teach with stories. Healing wasn't always about fixing the visible break. Most days it was about refusing to bolt when things got heavy. It was about sitting in the mess and saying, without fancy language, "I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." Sometimes people needed medicine or casts, but sometimes the first real shift started when someone finally believed they were worth staying for. That belief could move mountains quietly. Weeks rolled into winter, and despite all his calls and quiet questions, Mason never crossed paths with Nia again. Not really. He checked the uptown apartment sometimes, just to be sure the heat worked and the cupboards stayed stocked. The key remained on the little hook by the stove, untouched. But every so often a loaf of bread or a carton of milk would disappear. Once, a blanket Mason didn't remember buying appeared neatly folded on the couch. He took the hint and didn't install cameras. On certain evenings, walking past shelters or narrow side streets, he'd catch the faintest thread of humming rising above the traffic, soft, familiar, impossible to pin down. He'd pause, scanning the shadows, feeling warmth curl behind his ribs. There was never anyone there when he looked, just the echo of a melody that made the city feel smaller and kinder. Jonah started noticing it too. They'd be leaving a restaurant or cutting through a side street after a game, and he'd suddenly slow, head cocked. "Hear that?" he'd ask. Mason would listen and catch it, the faint hum woven under the rumble of buses and the chatter of pedestrians. No lyrics, just that low, steady tune that had wrapped itself around a scared boy's knees in a broken-roof room. "Think it's her?" Jonah would whisper. Mason never pretended certainty he didn't have. "Feels like her," he'd answer instead. Jonah would smile, shoulders settling, and take a few extra steps just because he could. In those moments, the city didn't feel like steel and danger. It felt like a living thing, full of hidden rooms and stubborn, unseen kindness. And somewhere inside all of that, they both trusted Naya was still moving quietly through the cracks. Mason's spreadsheets looked different to him after that winter. The numbers were the same. Columns of projections, profit margins, but they no longer felt like the only scorecard that mattered. Every time a deal involved bulldozing an old block, he pictured the alley where his son had stood for the first time, the church basement where kids lined up for soup, the curb where Nia had wrapped her arms around Tariq and simply stayed. He found himself funding clinics without putting his name on the plaque, funneling money toward shelters and legal aid instead of another glossy tower. He didn't talk about it at investor dinners. He just quietly rerouted part of the river he controlled. Sometimes, late at night, he'd stand by the condo window, city spread beneath him, and feel less like the man who owned pieces of it, and more like someone entrusted to protect its softer parts. Sometimes Mason would imagine Miss Etta and Nia like part of an underground network the city didn't even know it depended on. An unofficial emergency system made of hymns, hand-holding, and stubborn patience. He never did manage to track Miss Etta down again either. The building off Clark seemed to swallow its secrets whole. But he carried her words with him, especially on nights when headlines screamed about violence and greed. The heart listens to more than charts, she'd told him. Now, when he drove past corners where kids huddled against brick, he didn't just see blight or future development potential. He saw places where someone might be humming in the shadows, helping a stranger remember they weren't broken beyond repair. He couldn't rebuild every block, but he could stop pretending those quiet efforts didn't matter, or that his choices had nothing to do with whether they survived. The more distance he got from that first afternoon, the stranger it felt that his life had once been measured entirely in square feet and stock prices. A girl he'd almost walked past had shifted the axis of his world more than any merger. There was no spreadsheet cell for what she'd given them. A boy who believed in his own legs again. A father who remembered how to stand beside hurt without trying to buy his way around it. No quarterly report could track the value of a duct-taped pair of sneakers that had carried Nia from one hurting person to another. Yet Mason knew, with the same certainty he reserved for math, that his family's story would have bent darker without her. Somewhere between glass towers and alley stoops, a billionaire and a so-called beggar girl had become permanently, invisibly linked by grace. Years later, when Jonah was asked to speak at a school assembly about perseverance, he stood at the microphone, taller now, a faint scar still tracing his collarbone. Students shifted in the bleachers, half expecting a polished speech about physical therapy and medical breakthroughs. Instead, Jonah talked about the day everything changed in a forgotten courtyard behind a row of brownstones. He mentioned a room that smelled like lemon and dust, an old woman who hummed, and a girl in a ripped hoodie who looked him in the eye and spoke to him like he wasn't broken. "Doctors helped me," he said, "and I'm grateful for every one of them. But the first person who made me believe I could stand wasn't wearing a lab coat. She was just brave enough to say I wasn't finished yet." The gym went quiet in that charged, holy way silence sometimes gets. In another part of the city, Nia sat on a milk crate beside a teenager who'd just been jumped behind a corner store. Blood crusted along the boy's eyebrow. Anger crackled off him like static. Nia didn't lecture him about choices or crowds. She didn't offer easy forgiveness for the kids who'd swung first. She just passed him a clean rag, waited while he pressed it to the cut, and hummed under her breath. The same tune, always the same, like a thread stitching moments together. Healing, she'd realized, was rarely about swooping in with answers. It was about the stubborn decision to stay close to someone else's pain and say, with your whole presence, "I see you, and I'm not bailing." She couldn't undo every punch thrown in that alley, but she could make sure the boy didn't feel like his hurt made him disposable. Mason never actually caught up to Nia again, not face to face. But sometimes, closing a deal near Clark or parking outside a shelter fundraiser, he'd hear that low humming drift around a corner and feel warmth bloom beneath his ribs. Jonah would pause beside him, head tilted, a slow smile creeping across his face. "She's close," he'd murmur. Mason wouldn't argue. He'd just nod, letting the sound wash over him like a blessing he hadn't earned. Then they'd keep walking, father and son, steps steady, through a city that still scared him and amazed him in equal measure. Somewhere in those unlit doorways and basement halls, the quietest part of Chicago's heart was still beating, still listening, still refusing to walk away. And even if they never saw her again, both of them knew Naya was out there, humming people back toward themselves, one weary soul at a time. Hope can show up in the last place you'd ever look. If you've lived long enough to watch Chicago winters come and go, you know life can humble even the toughest man. Mason Larraby could raise glass towers like they were toothpicks, but he couldn't raise his own son out of a wheelchair. That kind of helplessness hits harder than any market crash. Then a skinny little girl with duct-taped sneakers steps out of an alley and says, "Sir, I can make your boy walk again." Every sensible bone in Mason's body should have kept pushing forward. But Jonah's eyes, those tired shut-down eyes, sparked for the first time in nearly 2 years. And that's the first lesson. Hope doesn't always come wrapped in white coats and polished clinics. Sometimes it comes as a quiet voice on a cold sidewalk, daring you to try one more time. Healing isn't only muscles and nerves, it's also guilt and the heart. Mason had done what many fathers do. He carried the what if like a 200-pound weight on his chest. Veil, the harder run, the terrible crack. Doctors called it permanent, like a final invoice. But in that dusty room that smelled like lemon balm, Miss Etta didn't argue with charts. She listened to pain. She made Mason sit down, breathe, and admit the truth. Guilt can crush a family as surely as any injury. When Jonah stood, shaking, trembling, barely holding his own weight, Mason saw something he couldn't buy. A boy trusting his body again. The second lesson is simple and hard-earned. The heart has its own kind of therapy, and sometimes it's the missing piece. Real change means staying, not showing off. Mason offered checks and fix-it money. Miss Etta asked for coats, groceries, lights that stay on. Nia didn't beg to be rescued. She asked for a key, for emergencies. That's the third lesson for those of us who have watched promises come and go. Help that lasts is quiet, steady, and humble. Jonah's steps didn't return overnight. They returned inch by inch. And Mason's life didn't change because he felt inspired. It changed because he kept showing up, even when no one was watching. If you were Mason, successful, powerful, but watching your child suffer, would you have followed that little girl into the alley, or would fear and common sense have kept you walking past? And in your own life, who has been your NIA, the unexpected person who reminded you you weren't finished yet? Share your story in the comments, because someone reading might need your words tonight. If this message meant something to you, please hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Each one is built to bring strength, hope, and practical lessons to our community.